Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It's a true pleasure to have you here at the Stimson Center today, and thank you so much for joining us for what I know will be a timely and thought-provoking conversation. My name is Julian Müller-Kala, and I direct our Strategic Foresight program here at the Center. Today, we want to launch Tech Cold War, the Geopolitics of Technology, a new book that really explores one of the most defining dynamics of our time, I think. The growing convergence of technological innovation and geopolitics. Not too long ago, technological development was mostly seen as an economic and commercial issue. But today, I think it is clear to everyone that high tech has come to define high politics too. From AI and semiconductors to 5G and quantum computing, technology is now deeply entangled in questions of national power, global influence, and strategic resilience. These days, it really feels like a tech breakthrough comes with both a product launch and a press conference at the Pentagon. Nowhere is this interconnection more evident than in the ongoing competition between the United States and China. A rivalry that is shaping not only markets and supply chains, but also norms, questions of global governance, and the future of international relations. In the last Cold War, we raced to the moon. In the new Cold War, we raced to secure supply chains and the best AI chips. Here at the Stimson Center, we aim to bring clarity to complexity for now more than 35 years. We are an independent, nonpartisan think tank dedicated to advancing international peace and security through practical policy solutions. And a big part of that mission involves anticipating global trends, fostering dialogues like the one that we do here, particularly among also emerging technologies. So we are really honored to host the authors of Tech Cold War, Ansgar Baums, who is one of our own, I might add, and a fellow German, and Nicholas Butts, whose insights are grounded in both rigorous analysis as well as practical experience. Their book helps illuminate how geotech statecraft has shaped over the last 15 years and what it might mean for the future. Now, for those of you who want to learn more and are intrigued by the conversation, you can actually purchase the book outside, and I might add, importantly, at a very distinct discount. So you have to make the promise that you refrain from reselling the copies that you acquire. With that, I want to thank you all again very much for being here. There will be time for Q&A after an initial discussion, both online as well as on site. And without any further ado, I want to hand it over to our moderator, Helen Sang, who's the co-founder of Intrigue Media. And she is a geotech expert herself, an ex-Googler, a former Australian diplomat, a Mandarin interpreter, not just translator, a Harvard alum, and most importantly, of course, a fellow Fulbrighter. So, Helen, please take it from here.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us here for this excellent discussion. When I got the invitation to come and moderate this, I immediately accepted because I know that this is one of the things that it's a defining feature of our ages. I know in the last few months, it's been a lot of information for all of us, a lot of flood the zone, and a lot of disruption, certainly, to the multilateral world order as we know it. I think in some ways, the US has disrupted the world order that they set up in 80 days that it took 80 years to set up, right? So I think a lot of this is going to be very pertinent for us to think about today. But I think what is missing from the discussion as we hear about all these things going on with tariffs and other, Greenland and all these other distractions is that the broader long-term play is the tech Cold War and what's happening here. So that's why I'm so pleased that we're able to join these two authors here on stage today to talk about this, because what's missing often is the corporate picture and what businesses think and how facts actually operate on the ground. So really pleased to throw the floor over to you two to start with. Tell us all, why are you two, who are tech execs, even writing a book about geopolitics? Why not write about something a little bit more, snazzy and keeping up with Silicon Valley? Why geopolitics?
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for Stimson Center hosting us. It's a great pleasure to be here. Why did we write this book? I think we could answer this on a couple of levels. So one is, I think we both are, by training, political scientists. International relations was our focus. We both ended up in the tech world, working for Silicon Valley companies. And for some time, there was a huge gap between what we actually were trained to do and what we were doing in corporations, right? There was literally no connection between the two worlds. So if you would try to discuss international relations in a tech company, you would find, bored faces, awkwardness. It wasn't really connected. In the end, tech companies operated on the assumption that international relations do not really matter anymore. International security doesn't matter anymore. We supersede the nation state. We supersede the security dilemma. Everything that was dear to a political scientist didn't really matter for tech execs. And that was kind of...
It was a cost center, wasn't it? I
Oh,
think
yeah.
a lot of big tech firms.
You try to minimize.
Yeah.
So no one was really keen to connect the worlds except for us. And then we felt over the last years that two worlds are emerging very, very quickly. And we were in this interesting spot where we could actually draw back to what we learned about structural realism in university and apply it actually to where corporations are actually today and apply it to management. And there wasn't much going on in that space, right? Yeah. So there's very few, let's say, literature about this kind of how does it really connect to each other. That's basically the biographical level of it. And then on the more abstract or analytical level, we felt that there is understandings on both sides. So there's certainly some parts that corporations do not get about the new world, right? So we see corporations still operating on the assumption of what we call the unipolar moment, like Charles Krautheimer called it, like this very unique moment in history where you had a unipolar world after 1990.
That's right.
Tech companies thought that's the normal, that's the baseline, and they don't get that the new world that we are entering in is not a short period that you can see through, but that's the new normal that you need to manage. That's the misunderstanding on the corporate side. On the policy bubble side, I'd say we saw also a couple of problems. One is the policy bubble doesn't get how corporations are reacting to geopolitical interferences and geopolitically motivated regulation. Two, the policy bubble doesn't really get how innovation is working and how fluid innovation is, and that you cannot apply the choke point theory to a very fluid innovation system. And number three is we had the feeling that China is misunderstood, particularly the speed and the creativity of the Chinese innovation ecosystem, which is not top-down. It's not a president deciding everything in China, but you have a tech ecosystem that's very, very agile. And we predicted when we wrote the book and in articles that there will be ugly surprises down the line because we create basically, we gave China something that they lacked before, which was necessity, for example, on high-end semiconductors. And once you added that to the innovation ecosystem in China, it really took off. So we felt on both sides there are problems, right? So we need to talk more to each other and not only with ourselves in the policy bubble and in the corporate space, but try to connect both worlds. And voila, I think the book is our attempt to somewhat build some bridges there.
And here we are. I do want to go back to those 2 points later on because I think there's a lot to unpack here and I want to make sure the audience here gets the full enjoyment from both these authors. But Nick, I want to turn to you now to think about, bring us up to speed about where we are today. What is this, how do we get to this tech Cold War, which sometimes, I'm not sure if Cold War is necessarily always the right framing, but I remember reading about Made in China 2025 back in 2017 and thinking, what on earth is this? And yet here we are. So let's zoom out a little bit for the audience and bring us up to where we are today.
Totally, and I think we call this out and we call out the Cold War analogy specifically, and I'll get back to that, why we think that it's a useful lens actually. So first and foremost, it's not new that governments have interfered in private corporations and with, to Julian's point early, like for economic measures, for defense purposes. I think what we saw after the end of the Cold War, as Ansgar says, is this end of history theory that extended into Silicon Valley. And you see that in the creation of the digital tech companies that we know today, which were created with this belief that there was no national borders. Right? And so some of the biggest tech companies that we have today are created thinking that the internet would have sort of circumvented that. And what we're seeing now is this geopolitical reality check, if you will. You can see that if you take a corporate perspective, Google, Facebook both tried to enter China for a while. OpenAI and Anthropic didn't even bother. And so you see this shift between 20, 25, 30 years ago into today. And what we call in the book geotech statecraft is essentially this attempt by governments to manage national security externalities. And we trace it back, starting with some of the Chinese industrial policy that we've seen. China entered the WTO, but then also with the Snowden revelation in the US that sort of had a glow up or a blow up again recently. China's made in China 2025 plan, a One Belt, One Road strategy, and then what we saw unfold with Trump 1 and the US-China trade war originally, continued by the Biden administration around export controls. And so we have this, what we claim is a quote-unquote tech Cold War that's dominated by a systemic rivalry between two different systems. They're not necessarily ideological competing systems as directly as during the Cold War, but they are separate systems themselves. We have this security dilemma where and I think particularly true today as we see unfold day to day, it's impossible to tell what are defensive and what are offensive reactions in this tit-for-tat dynamic that we now have between the US and China. And then finally, for us, we see that manifest, and Julian spoke about this in his introduction, in the tech space, whether that's in AI, whether that's in quantum, whether that's in 5G. And so what we outline in the book is essentially the strategies under different US administration and what has been going on in China. So just obviously read the book and you'll find the full analysis, but it's just super high level and brief. Trump 1.0. The main strategy that the president took then was definitely moving away from a more allied approach and having sort of US go at it a bit alone. But what we compliment the president for back then was very clear stated goals around what they wanted to achieve, essentially decrease the trade deficit. Now, you can argue, and we have our personal view on whether that's a good goal or not, but there was a very clearly stated goal that they wanted to achieve. The Biden administration took a more sensible approach from our perspective around making sure that you align with your allies and coordinate some of your response with your allies and double down on that. What the Biden administration didn't do well, and we outline this in the book, is having clear yardsticks. Like if you go back to like reading anything that came out of the Biden White House, what was it that they wanted China to do? What were the specific yardsticks that they would like to see from China? And I think speaking to a lot of folks in China for the book also, that was very unclear to the Chinese in terms of how to navigate that relationship. And I think that unfolded. You know, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan talked about small yard, high fence, and that was sort of the strategy from the US. We see that as fundamentally misunderstanding how technology works. You cannot maintain a small yard because what you're seeing today is everything is being securitized. It used to be only chips. Now it's chips and AI. Soon it'll be chips, AI, and energy. And then it'll be biotech, climate tech, et cetera, et cetera. So everything becomes about national security. So the yard is always expanding. And the high fence, there's a lot of holes in the fence. Even if you have restrictions, companies will find ways to evade those, or they will find ways to like work around it. And on the Chinese side, you see the same thing with controls over chips. You see, to Ansgar's point, like Chinese innovation driving around that. DeepSeek is a great example of compute restrictions focusing on one specific area of technology and then being circumvented by innovation in how to leverage compute for inference and training for AI-specific products, for example, right? So for us, that's sort of like what we see on the, and we were both laughing about this because Paul Triolo, who is one of the people we interviewed for the book, came up with this, you know, small gain, high cost, as opposed to small yard, high fence, which we wish we had for the book, because that's, I think, a brilliant analogy. But we're actually quite critical of the Biden administration.
What is the small gains there?
Well, like for us, from our perspective, like what has been really gained by very extensive, very expensive U.S. export controls on technology. There's not a long list of wins. And in fact, you see this like with big impact to R&D budgets on private companies in the US and technology that are losing that ability to continue to invest in maintaining tech advantage compared to China, where, to Ansgar's point, before you had very expensive semiconductor funds in China that basically were driven more or less by corruption in Fund 1 and Fund 2. Because if you're a Chinese SOE, why would you bother buying Chinese tech if you could buy NVIDIA? NVIDIA chips are the best. So even if you have a mandate from government that you should consider buying more Chinese, you're going to buy the best. all of a sudden, if that choice is removed, you're going to go back to the Chinese semiconductor companies and you're going to say, guys, we're going to need to like get our act together now because we don't have that choice anymore. And so for us, it's sort of double damaging. You've encouraged Chinese innovation and you've hurt US R&D.
That's right.
And so like from a Chinese perspective, and I think this is really important that we feel is like missed in particular in DC. And Helen, you're an expert on this. I spent some time in China as well. I think like the first myth that we would like to dispel, and we spent some pages in the book about this, is sort of the accession to WTO. It's always presented here in the US that like China tricked the US somehow to be let into the WTO, but it was actually American private business really advocating for that.
Right.
And inside of China, huge domestic political debate on whether or not they should. Li Peng, who was like the Chinese like communist princeling, lost the premiership to Zhu Rongji, and they were fighting it out between the two of them. Zhu Rongji didn't feel like he could get enough reforms of SOEs, and so used the WTO to essentially drive more political reform. So actually, from a Chinese perspective, the incentive behind joining WTO was not this sort of like long-term marathon scheme to trick the US. It was actually to drive domestic economic reform in China. And then you've seen a lot of changes recently with industrial policy. And so at one point, you had China be the quote-unquote defender of globalization. That was in Trump Point 1, where Xi gave this big speech in the World Economic Forum, where he sort of stood up and say, if U.S. is retreating, China will step in. We see the same dynamic happening today. The problem for China has been then this balance between control and growth. And so after this speech, you unfortunately see a lot of really poor moves by the Chinese government, starting with a crackdown on its own domestic tech sector that it had been promoting as part of One Belt, One Road. And then you secondarily have zero COVID policy that basically destroyed Chinese economy. And so now you have Chinese government that's straggling between maintaining tight political control and driving economic growth and having a huge challenge around that. So today, you have Trump 2.0, and you have all this unfolding. What still is not clear from our perspective in terms of US is, what does the US actually want to achieve with China? What would it like to see China do more or less of? Clearly articulating that. On the Chinese side, is this shifting away from having so much focused on control, and we talk a lot about some of the domestic policy vehicles that the CCP have been using around that, and then shifting towards growth. The problem with the current Trump administration's approach is, it used to be that no one believed China saying like, we're again open for business after these crackdowns. There's a huge disbelief in international business operating inside of China wanting to invest in China anymore, because frankly, they didn't believe the Chinese. They knew they're going to double down on growth. And what you're seeing now with the current administration's approach is they've essentially given China a new avenue, a new opportunity to position itself as sort of quote-unquote defender of globalization.
And that only takes us up to Trump 2.0. Wow,
Yes.
okay. I can't wait to see what unfolds in the next little while. I want to bring us back to the corporations, Ansgar, because I know you had mentioned this and the role of corporations in all of this, because these high-level, government-to-government discussions are often missed at the sort of corporations, business-to-business level. Now, over the last 4 years, we've seen AmCham, the American Chamber of Commerce, really pull out of China, right? And journalists, American students, American businesses really kind of pulling out of that market and either relocating to other parts of Southeast Asia, North Asia, or elsewhere, right, in the UAE or other parts of the Middle East. So, Ansgar, can you tell the audience here, or just tell us, how businesses and corporations have actually navigated all this, and what does geopolitics and its impact look like for a corporation and corporate perspective?
Sure. Yeah,
Not good is a vibe, I think.
So we basically report from our own experience, right?
Yeah.
So we were both on the same team at HP when the first Trump administration actually started the 301 tariffs, etc. PP. So we were responsible for somewhat, trying to deal with it on a short-term, very tactical level of just trying to get, the PCs and the printers into the US without paying prohibitive tariffs. But then also think about it long-term, like how do we need to set up the corporation long-term in order to be more resilient in geopolitical terms. And yeah, I think from my perspective, it's a little bit like an iceberg, right? So on the top level, you have basically geopolitical crisis events. Something is happening and you need to react immediately.
Trump issuing tariffs or...
Exactly, some tariffs are dropped, or you have some disturbance, like some crisis in the
an executive
south.
Order or something
Something like that, or even an incident around Taiwan, two ships colliding and it spins into into the crisis. That's basically where corporations have something they call like business continuity management, BCM, as a kind of a short-term tactical response, right? And that's very much about like shuffling around supplies and, huge dashboards and many monitors and people frantically, calling suppliers and that kind of stuff. So that's the one part, which is literally from my perspective, that's the small part that's above water, right? And corporations are usually pretty good at doing this, right? It's in the end, HP was a big logistics company to some degree. Then you have a middle layer, which is what we call geotech statecraft. And that's what Nick already mentioned. That's basically the attempt to weaponize tech supply chains for geopolitical purposes, right? It's interesting because it's a response from governments to globalization, right? If the supply chains are global, you try to basically leverage these supply chains for your own purposes, right? This is what we do in ESG, by the way, right? So you follow the supply chain and you make corporations responsible for implementing your political agenda in their supply chain, no matter where it's located. And that's basically the same logic that governments are now applying in order to pursue their geopolitical goals. On an abstract level, you could argue this is an attempt of internalizing the negative externalities of tech dissemination to your geopolitical goals, right?
Which China has done very well, by the way, because they have state-owned enterprises, right, and sort of top-down approaches to this. But the West doesn't have that.
Historically, that's the normal, right? So governments always try to limit or control, steer the dissemination of technology according to their national security needs. So in the 9th century, swords were export controlled in the Carolingian Empire. Vice versa, this is what Newman and Farrell actually highlight in their book, Underground Empire. Sometimes there are cases where governments try to promote the dissemination of technology if it serves their purposes. If everybody's communicating on the internet, which is dominated by US tech, well, guess what? US foreign policy was actually in favor of pushing out these technologies.
Yeah.
And what we've seen over the last years is a complete reversal of that position. Back then, it was like you have a problem in Saudi Arabia, you call US State Department as a US corporation, they will help you. Today, it's a very different game, right? They rather call you and say, like, you cannot sell here anymore because we don't want this technology to be in the hands of X and Y. So US policy making with regard to controlling the dissemination of technology has done a 180-degree turn. And corporations now need to deal with it. And in particular, US companies are not used to that kind of game, right? Because the US government was usually on their side, except for specific military goods or dual use or whatever. But other than that, US government was always a friend of US tech selling abroad. And that is changing. And by the way, if you look at history, Great Britain, 19th century, in London, it was exactly the same situation. British government was concerned about the rise of Germany. British companies were very happy to do business abroad with German companies. So you see this split between the agenda of the government in the hegemon country and the corporations when there is a competitor rising. Companies still want to do trade, even with the geopolitical competitor, while the hegemon's government is concerned. This is exactly where we are right now here in the US. And this is what we felt actually when we worked at HP, right? And governments and corporations now need to somewhat deal with this geotech statecraft. In practice, that's a whole catalog of tools, export controls, import controls, investment controls, you name it, ICTS, connected vehicles, entity bans, the Huawei saga, etc., pp, data localization requirements. All these are basically tools to somewhat steer the dissemination of technology in the direction that you actually perceive as in accordance with your geopolitical agenda. That's the middle level, and that's keeping corporations insanely busy. Honestly, corporations haven't had the muscle to actually deal with the amount of new stuff hitting them, right, over the last years. And the third level, that's literally the lowest level of the iceberg and probably the most difficult one to deal with, is what we call the split of the IT stack. And what we think is that politics is fundamentally changing the development of technology. On an abstract level, you could argue, over the last 30 years, we had a unified IT stack. We basically used the same IT technology worldwide, right? Same compute chips, same operating systems available everywhere. We thought it's global because technology wants to be global. We think that was a mistake. in the end, this technology stack was unipolar because it was born in the unipolar moment, and it was dominated by US technology because the US was the dominant power. Now that we enter a more bipolarish world, we see that the ICT stack is following basically this geopolitical metastructure, and it's also becoming bipolar. Means China is developing its own IT stack, independent of US IP, independent of US vendors. If you look, and we discussed this in the book at length, starting at the compute level, so we look at how RISC-V is becoming an alternative compute architecture to become independent from ARM or x86 chips, and we go all the way up to the application level where basically the split in two stacks is already almost complete, right? And this is a world, this has plenty of political consequences, but it's also the most fundamental strategic questions that all big tech companies right now are facing, be it corporations in the automotive space or in IoT or in cloud computing. And that basically means if you have two stacks, one Chinese-centric and one Western-centric, in which stack do I need to play? If I do not play in the Chinese stack, I lose the TAM of the Chinese market. So can I afford
Explain
this?
TAM.
Total addressable market, sorry. Or if I cannot afford to lose the total addressable market of China, I need to invest in two IT stacks. And that's a real dilemma, because if you have one R&D dollar and you have to split it in two, you might fall behind those companies who only focus on one stack, right? So it's
Particularly
a really
for
difficult...
SMEs, right? The small and medium enterprises.
But even the biggest companies are struggling because committing to a Chinese IT stack. So imagine you're a car company and you need to build a car that's based on Chinese semiconductors and Chinese encryption and Chinese imagery on cartographic materials, because you cannot use the stuff that you would usually use here in the US. You basically build a completely second car only for the Chinese market. Overhead costs go through the roof, and still you're politically vulnerable because you might get, some heat from your government. So, and that's basically where corporations are right now. It's a fundamental strategic dilemma that corporations are dealing with, and where we see plenty of companies making one bet or the other. Our hypothesis is that corporations are also polarizing. Some will go all in China because they cannot afford not to, and some will basically exit China because it's becoming too complex and too expensive. Also means that corporations who go all in China will try to insulate their operations in China as much as they can from the rest of the corporation. So ironically, corporations then also become bipolar, right?
Yeah.
So you will have one China business almost independent from rest of world operations, simply because you want to minimize the links where you can actually be, where you're vulnerable to geotech statecraft, to export controls on IP, deemed exports, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And I think what's missing from this discussion is also what consumers want, right? I think we've seen from all sorts of technologies ranging from EVs to sort of, the handheld devices and tablets and things like this. What do consumers want? And I don't think there's enough feedback loop yet, particularly in the global south or global majority, on what that looks like. So I'm really curious to see where that goes. I mean, just as an aside for those, when I was working at Google, I remember I had to do a presentation about where the market was headed, right? And there were two polar bears fighting on an ice. One was Google, one was Meta. And I was like, guys, it's not about these two polar bears. The ice sheet is melting. And that's what's happening with the geopolitical picture of bifurcation of China, US. Now, we've talked a lot about those two countries. I do want to bring the attention back to the rest of the world and what this dynamic means for all of us here in this room, those listening, and this country and China going forward. What does this mean going forward? What can you talk us through the next sort of 6 to 12 months? I fear sort of projecting any further because at the rate things change these days, things move quickly.
I think that's smart, and we used to do this, and to some extent are still doing this. So sort of maybe focusing initially on U.S. China quickly and then expanding it to broader, right? So what you'll see now, you have the president ramping up tariffs clearly in sort of an attempt to perhaps from a PR perspective manage the fact that you walk back the tariffs on the rest of the world. But also in part because there's a real desire with the administration, continued from the previous administrations, I should say, in quote unquote dealing with China. I think the main thing that a lot of folks in DC are missing is sort of the Chinese response.
Right.
I think the thinking through how the Chinese will act, and also understanding that the Chinese have learned from Trump 1.0 through to today in terms of what they need to do. And I think Xi is also in a different position of power than he was back in the day. And I think
How
that's
so? Can you explain?
so, in a couple ways. You see recently now there's been a new sort of corruption drive in PLA. That has been a continuation of CCP leadership under Xi. You have much more party ideological driven leadership in China. You had a period of time, that, as we talked about, where after zero COVID, after the tech crackdown, where there was a real concern inside of China about macroeconomics, and there was a real concern in particular with AI, that sort of China had quote unquote missed the boat. I think now with DeepSeek, with Manus and other things, there's sort of a sentiment that maybe we have figured this out. You saw there's the kiss of the ring for Jack Ma coming back up on stage with a number of other Chinese tech leaders in with Xi, and I think there's a real push towards moving the needle back from control, maybe a bit more towards growth, firstly. I think secondly, there's also how to deal with the president. And I think from a Chinese perspective, you see this with TikTok. To me, the discussion around what should we do about TikTok and then not thinking through whether the Chinese government or not will allow that deal to go through is not doing your job right. And I think you've seen that now with, they had a deal on TikTok that would have been beneficial from a US national security perspective, from an economic perspective, that the Chinese walked away in part because of the increase on tariffs. And I think you're seeing now the White House trying to send signals to China, if only you will call us and ask for a meeting, we can then set up some deal time, but you have to call us so that we can say that, the Chinese, if it worked, the Chinese called us to make a deal. That's sort of like, and I think on the Chinese side, they're like, nope, we don't need to. And they spent the last 10 years trying to make themselves more independent from US tech. And so I think that's sort of the challenge. And so my personal prediction in the next 6 to 12 months, or from my individual perspective, you're going to see a lot of noise, a bit similar to what you saw under Trump 1.0, and then you're going to have some sort of deal announcement. I think if you look at what would the result of that be, people have already forgotten that we had this whole show that was our lives for 2.5 years. Every weekend, I can't mention the times I got called out from like brunch with my wife on weekend because the president had tweeted something about tariffs and we need to go deal with it. That was 2 years of my life. That was pretty intense. And we got the phase one deal out of it that people have forgotten. There was a whole deal that US and China struck in order to sort of agree and make Chinese commitments towards bringing down the trade deficit. Where are we today? Unprecedentedly high. Nothing has really changed. And so my prediction, you will see the same thing. The Chinese have learned, need to navigate this. They have a bit longer lens. I think the more interesting bit will be what will happen with the rest of the world. And this is partly why we think the Cold War analogy is interesting, because people always focus when they say, oh, but Cold War is overused, it's not the same. China and the US is way more interconnected than the Soviet Union and the US used to be. That's true. And it's sort of like, it's a lot more intense and dynamic today. The Cold War was pretty dynamic, and there was a huge movement of non-aligned countries that very much was in the middle of that, and you're seeing that today. You're seeing push and pull in countries like India, in Singapore, in UAE. Our argument is the position from a government perspective in these non-aligned countries to sort of be, we will play in both stacks. That strategy will come untenable. And UAE is a great example of a government that has kind of declared allegiance towards the US recently.
Yeah, and had to divest all their Chinese interests, right?
And I think that you'll see that more and more. And you'll see some countries trying to maintain and even benefit from being that bridge, playing in both. Our claim is that will become too expensive with too little yield. You're going to have to declare allegiance to one or the other. Now, interestingly, as two Europeans who have spent a lot of time in DC, Europe is having this glow-up moment of now we're going to have European tech sovereignty.
Yeah.
As a Dane, I can empathize. I will just say, speaking personally, we have not appreciated the way that the US have talked about Greenland and Denmark being a bad ally. As the first country that called the US NATO ambassador after 9/11, the country with the highest number of casualties per capita in Iraq and Afghanistan, having the VP say that we've been a bad ally did not sit well with a lot of folks that I know. And I will say that sort of drive and sentiment is now manifesting in literally people boycotting American products. My own family boycotting, who are very not political, boycotting at a sort of very basic level American products. But at a systemic level, we're seeing the same thing with tech companies. You're seeing now potential threats of having tariffs put on services where, by the way, people forget this. The services trade deficit is to the U.S. benefit.
Exactly.
The president just forgets to mention that sometimes when he talks about trade deficit. But I think that is a huge challenge right now for a number of tech companies where they're worried about this. Our argument, though, in the book still holds, which is if you look at the European tech stack, the way that we analyze it, IT from, as Ansgar said, compute architecture, input commodities from semiconductors through hardware, software, cloud, data, and application layer, European tech stack, quote unquote, today is 85% American.
Right.
And so the capital, the CapEx investment required to do that, the huge transformation of industrial policy in order to achieve a quote unquote truly European tech stack is enormous. We're talking CHIPS Act times a gazillion. And so for us, that will be really, really difficult to achieve. And I think what you're more likely to see is the Europeans being a little bit more coy with China. I think there's an understanding that that's not the long-term strategic bet either. But I think they're sort of, okay, if we're being received less well in Washington, D.C., maybe we should try to reinvigorate some of the relationships there. And you're seeing, interestingly, a new FTA between potentially EU and UAE, which, from my perspective, is that attempt of trying to nestle yourself in between. But a quote-unquote independent IT stack, we don't see it anywhere else other than US-led Western IT stack and a Chinese IT stack.
Where do you think Europe will sort of try and innovate, though? Do you think there's anywhere that they can sort of pull ahead? And maybe, Ansgar, you can talk to this and also the first question that I asked too.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with Nick, right? In the end, we need to seriously talk numbers, right? If you think about Eurostack, European, who's going to invest just the money you would need to create an alternative compute architecture not dependent on US intellectual property? Seriously. We were talking about investment plans that would go on for decades, would cost billions and billions, that no one can afford. For IT, that would be basically more expensive in the end because the total addressable market you produce it for will be much smaller, right? So, I'm always struck how easily politicians in Europe talk about this kind of European stack idea without
getting challenged.
And no one's checking them on numbers. So I simply don't see it from a maths perspective, completely unrealistic. And by the way, who will be the companies who are actually investing there? I mean, literally, name me a company who would invest billions of its revenue in just establishing a fundamental compute architecture. It doesn't make sense, right? And we've seen how difficult it is even for the big guys like Intel and others to change tack and adapt to geopolitical realities. So it's completely unrealistic, and no one calls political decision makers out if they just go around and tell the story, right? So fundamentally, I see Europe's role is to be part of the Western IT stack, full stop. It's not going to be part of the Chinese IT stack. It's not going to be in the middle. There's not going to be an independent stack. If that's true, the strategy of Europe needs to attune to that, and it's going to be a different strategy than vis-a-vis China, right? Calling both strategies versus China and versus the US, both technological sovereignty, doesn't make sense, right? If it's two different things, you have to have two different names. We don't even have that in Europe, right? Everything is technological sovereignty right now. So my high-level perspective is, if you are part of the Western IT stack and it's still dominated by the US, you need to focus on that relationship, and you need to think about how to become less vulnerable within that relationship. So it's interdependence management. That's basically the exercise that you need to focus on. And instead of, let's say, trying to minimize, de-risk, decouple, or whatever from this IT stack with no alternative, my recommendation would be actually, you just need to become so important in this stack that no one can afford really to hurt you badly, right? I was saying the best insurance company that Europe has is that 50-60% of US companies are using SAP software.
Yes.
Right?
Me included. It's a great software.
Everybody uses it. So if you switch that off, the kill switch debate, it would hurt. So you rather not, get into that fight. And I think my recommendation to Europe would therefore be, you just need to focus on innovation and becoming really, really good in stuff that no US company can afford not to have. That's
Both on the hardware and the software.
both on the hardware and the software side. This is where you need to focus on, and this actually also makes tons of sense from a wealth perspective, wealth creation perspective, etc. pp. Rather than becoming defensive, than trying to rip out technology and replace it with something probably inferior. That doesn't make sense economically, and I'm highly encouraging Europe to look through the smoke. And admittedly, there's a lot right now, and it's hard to, but still you should see the US relationship as on a fundamentally different level than the strategic competition with China. And vice versa, I'm just telling you, like, I mean, in the end, Nick and I, we spent long years on trying to sell US big tech in Europe, right? We worked for several US companies. I worked for HP, Zoom, Hewlett-Packard. We tried to sell the value proposition of US tech in Europe. That was our core job. Just can tell you, it's getting really difficult because the value proposition is somewhat getting more difficult to actually explain, right? And I can only tell you, like the recent case of Maxar, like this, I think it was misunderstood what actually happened with Maxar and this imagery services. Basically, US government seemed to just not have continued a contract with this firm. But it triggered a frantic debate in Europe about the hypothetical kill switch that the Trump administration could switch off US hyperscalers in Europe. That's driving policy thinking right now in Europe.
Yeah.
And honestly, we do not really have good answers. What are you going to tell these guys? Is it not a real risk? Or how do you actually, what's the sales pitch in that regard? And it's to me, it's stunning that this kind of fallout of US policy making right now is not factored in the discourse here, because it's literally toxic what's currently happening, and it's becoming more and more difficult to actually be the sales guy who's running around Europe and trying to sell US big tech to your closest geopolitical ally.
It must be very frustrating for folks who are aware of it and are trying to sort of, make the US sit up and take notice of this, or this current administration. I do want to make sure we've got enough time for questions, but before I turn over to the audience, so please have your questions ready. I do want to come back to your point, Ansgar, earlier, and I want to make sure the audience understands this, because it's a really important point, 2 points that you made. The 2 things that are missing from the game and people fundamentally misunderstand is China's domestic decision-making process, as well as this idea of innovation and being able to choke down innovation. So can you just quickly expand on those 2 points, and then we'll take some audience questions.
Sure. So I think the fundamental misunderstanding is how innovation actually happens. The policy bubble idea is that innovation is linear. So if you have one part of the innovation chain that is in control of one singular company, and you basically press on that company and you basically say, like, you don't export anymore, happened with NVIDIA chips or with ASML machines, then down the line the other side will not be able to innovate anymore, right? That's the very linear, throw something in the river and water flow will stop kind of idea. We basically looked at this idea even back at HP, right? When 2018-19, we were discussing the scenarios, and whenever we talked to technologists, they were just like,
that's not how
literally
it
telling you
works.
that this is a crazy idea, right?
Yeah.
We as technologies, for us, these constraints that you are creating here, that's the food that we live on, right? This is basically, if you have a constraint like this and it needs to be solved, we as technologies, we get the money that we need to actually solve it. So what you are doing is basically, that's catnip for innovation. And exactly this happened in China, right? So you introduced a constraint, and that is the focal point then of innovation. And as Nick explained, what's really moving the innovation ecosystem in China, of course, is when you have the big players, the big guys who really know what they're doing, like Alibaba, Tencent, and all the others, Baidu, BYD. When they have a constraint and they turn around to the Chinese ecosystem and say, like, you better get going because we need you, and we're not going to be able to buy NVIDIA chips, then stuff is happening in China. And that's completely a different kind of dynamic here than you usually read when you get the impression that in China everything is directed by Xi, right? So big fund 1 and 2, Nick mentioned them. big semiconductor subvention programs, subsidy programs, corruption to the highest level, complete disaster, nothing came out of it, complete failure. Because they were top down, you had graft, fake companies, etc. pp. Big Fund 3 will be a big success. Why? Because of US export controls. Right? You made, with your export controls, you made Chinese semiconductor programs a success. That's crazy, right? That's exactly not what you want. So we think this whole idea is completely like it's contradictory, and it's not serving your interest at all. Why? Because you had the wrong idea of how innovation actually works. And this is where I'm frustrated, because you can get that feedback anytime, when you talk to the technologists in US companies. They will all tell you the story, but they're not part of the discussion, and that's frustrating.
Hopefully that changes. Nick, go ahead.
And this is this is the strategy that China is pursuing, recognizing the national security and geopolitical value of diffusion of its tech.
Exactly.
And that is sort of the exact counter that the U.S. is doing when it's making U.S. products more expensive.
Yeah.
And I think the one good thing that's come out of all the tariff nonsense in the last couple of weeks have been highlighting the actual cost. And we call this out in the book. I think the cost to the consumer is sort of the underlying unspoken in all political debates. When you say we want US, we want Europe, we want Chinese tech, who's willing to pay for it? Anyone in here, which government is the only government that will pay extra money for Made in America? Does anyone know there's like one customer that will do that? No one knows. It's not the US federal government. It's not US companies, it's the Israeli government. So even in the US, our federal procurement laws, it's structured in a way that incentivizes a procurement officer in DOD to buy the cheapest, not Made in America. And so until we get that right, until we recognize that there's a price to pay, or until we're willing to pay $3,500 for our iPhone instead of $1,000, or in Europe's case, 10,000, because we need to build up from the ground up the new European tech stack so we can have European equivalents of iPhones, we're not going to get there.
Yeah. I think everyone saw that meme of the flight leaving out of, I think, Cambodia with the last shipping of the iPhones before the tariffs hit. Now I'm going to get to the questions online, so please raise your hand here if you have questions too. First one is from Jake M. from Georgetown University. Thanks for your question, Jake. So China seems to have been able to harness its state-owned enterprises to mitigate risk and leverage its tech advancements across government and industry. So what are the gaps between the US government and US tech industry, and what solutions are there to promote better public-private partnerships?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk a little bit about the Chinese side in particular, and Ansgar, you should weigh in here. But just two things on that. The relationship between SOEs and Chinese government is sort of very complex, right? There's a lot of unwritten ways of supporting. There's a lot of access to capital benefits that sort of is never captured anywhere that is very close to it. The challenge, if you actually talk to Chinese SOEs and having spent some time there, they have their same own complicated relationship with Chinese government.
Some things are universal.
Yes,
you know?
there was a FT article a couple years back about Chinese government, a directive, Hongzhou Weixian, like a red-headed letter document, a Communist Party directive that says local government need to stop buying American tech. And most SOEs that you talk to are like, yeah, we're not going to do that. Because American products are still better.
Yeah.
And so it is more complicated than just the SOEs being in an extended, uniform, 100% aligned to the Chinese government arm. It is not. I think where there's been some benefits is the close coordination, and I think where US could do a better job is thinking in the business and the corporate perspective as they're pursuing these regulations. Chip export's a great example. You saw in October 2022, Biden administration issued a new threshold for chips controls of what could be exported without a license.
Yeah.
NVIDIA, ARM, and Intel a month later released a new architecture that meant they could still continue to export without a license. That new architecture, I bet you, is a couple of lawyers that came up with a new memo that said, actually, it turns out our previous memo was wrong, and we now have a new memo. And then it took the US government and probably like 75% of BIS capacity to develop a new policy that set that threshold a little bit lower. And then it took Intel and NVIDIA a week to come up with a new memo that said, actually, our new threshold is even lower and we can continue to sell without a license. And by the way, at the same time, you have bulk applications for continuing to sell, and you have this in the coverage of Huawei, for example, that's been sort of PR story is we took entity list actions against Huawei. Sales stopped to Huawei. That's not true. 95% of license applications to continue to sell to Huawei were approved by the BIS. There's been some great studies actually that applications from companies headquartered in more red-leaning states had a 10 plus percentage point favor of license applications. I would imagine that would be the same case for the new license applications that we're likely to see with tariffs and Trump. So I think there's some lessons in terms of coordinating better. Importantly, though, it's important we don't we take China's playbook. There's a reason why the U.S. has exceptional technological leadership. It's the capitalist system. And so I think really important that we don't sort of move over to a state-driven industrial policy and we copy Chinese policies because we are worried about it. The reason why we're in this technology leadership position we're in is because of the things like open immigration, huge access to talent and capital, free-flowing ideas and being able to challenge those. And that's exactly the type of policies, the opposite policies that China, with its tech crackdown, with its zero COVID policy, that caused huge economic challenges for China. And so if the US focused less on trying to trip up China and more on like just doing what we do, which is great, we would win in the long term.
Let me just add to that. I'm not a fan of all that public-private partnership stuff because I saw corporations being literally corrupted not in a strict term of corruption as a felony, whatever, but literally producing stuff that they wouldn't have produced if it wasn't for some government intervention that basically led astray, right? It's public money comes with strings attached, always, and it comes with a message, and it doesn't come with the business acumen and the experience that you would have when money comes from VCs, from investors, etc. pp. So I fundamentally think public money for corporations is a risk, is a danger. And in Europe, it's particularly popular right now to think big about these kind of corporations, etc. pp. I've seen too many companies ending up basically in a dead-end street. They produce stuff that you can sell then to one government, right? And it was designed according to the wishes of this government that gave you the money, but it's unsellable in the commercial market. And then you've wasted a lot of talent and people just producing this one thing, and you become less competitive, right? So it's a real risk, and I'm just very, very, let's say, cautious when it comes to entering these schemes. And then we had all these big plans, like even, we see how complicated it is in practice, CHIPS Act. If you look at the projects in Germany, like Intel factory in Magdeburg, etc. pp., if you look at the reality on the ground, it's always a mess. It's always much more difficult. It's always basically waste. So I'm not sure we should follow exactly. We try to copy or take a page out of the Chinese book. China is a different system with all its advantages and plenty of disadvantages. Yes. We have very critical parts in the book about China, right, where we basically assess that Xi's system is a big risk to China's capacity to overcome the middle income trap, right? Xi is a real problem for Chinese economic development, just to set that clear. But I think we shouldn't try to copy. What we find interesting is that it's a little bit like, again, back to the Cold War. In the end, when Kennan formulated containment strategy, he was pretty clear that you had this element of containment towards the Soviet Union. But what he was really saying is that the thing that will ultimately win the Cold War, it's our own strength, right? That's what we need to focus on. And it's mind-boggling how few thoughts are given on this kind of, what is actually the relationship between our strength and winning a Cold War. It seems to be disconnected. Bill Reinsch from CSI has had this great quote by, there are basically two ways of winning a race, right? Either you focus on running faster or you try to trip the other guy over. Yeah. It seems like the pendulum in the US has swung massively into the direction of thinking only how to disturb China rather than really trying to focus on its own strength. And this is what we find as outsiders. We're from Europe, right? we look at it from the outside, we see the secret sauce that the US had, but it seems like it somehow lost the belief that this is the recipe that will lead to success, and we clearly believe in that. So in that regard, we are pretty retro with regard to the policy mix that you need to succeed.
Vintage, I think.
Yes.
I think, you see that America First idea permeating through a lot of the funds from Silicon Valley now, especially things like General Catalyst, America Frontier Fund, places like that I think are now trying to drive that and trying to sort of bring that narrative back to America being exceptional and actually demonstrating by being competitive.
Yeah.
I want to check with the organizers how much time we've got, because I was 15, okay, great, plenty of time. So one audience question here, and then I think I want to get to one here because it's on AI and it's my favorite topic.
Thank you.
Please introduce yourself too.
My name is Mark. I'm from United Daily News. We're based in Taiwan. So my question is, NVIDIA just announced a huge investment deal to the United States this morning, building an AI supercomputer in the United States. And I'm just wondering, can we interpret Trump 2.0 policy that making chips, semiconductor, and AI supply chain to come to U.S. as part of a de-risking strategy from the geopolitical variables? And also, Taiwan has making this, since we talk about innovation, Taiwan has made innovation as part of its national security strategy, as trying to be irreplaceable from semiconductor. But it seems right now it's still quite expendable. I'm just wondering, do you think Taiwan is expendable from an industry view? Thank you.
Maybe start with the last. Is Taiwan expendable right now? Absolutely not. That's the irony that we see, right? So, reflecting the geopolitical naivety of IT and tech industry, we build basically value chains and supply chains that run right through the geopolitically most volatile regions in the world, right? It's just joking to Nick. It's just like sending your kid to school through the worst neighborhoods in the city is basically how we built value chains over the last 30, 40 years.
And tectonic activities as well.
And tectonic activities as well. So in the end, zero consideration for resilience, all consideration for efficiency led us to a setup where you have on several parts of the value chain, high concentration of vendors, literally sometimes only one or two, right? Like ASML and stuff, and in a, putting all eggs in one basket in a region that's geopolitically fraught. So, and if you look at what Taiwan offers to the tech industry with regard to manufacturing capacities and the wafer space, et cetera, pp., it's not replaceable. There is no alternative. And the truth is, if you take away the political rhetoric of everybody talking about CHIPS Act and investments in the US, everybody in the tech industry knows for the next 20 years, this will be the case. That's the reality. And if you do not face that, you will make wrong decisions. If you think that we can de-risk Taiwan within 5 years until 2027, I don't know what, you're mistaken. Not going to happen. That's the reality. And if you think about, you look at the scenarios for what would a hot conflict around Taiwan mean for global GDP, it's an absolute disaster. Right? Absolute disaster. And that's the reality. So we are very actually, we have a really bad feeling when it comes to Taiwan for the volatility of the situation. We think we're much closer to an unwanted escalation than we might think. There's just too much activity in the region with regard to navies and border patrol, whatever, and not enough stable ways of communicating and making sure that there's a way to off-ramp an escalation. We don't have that governance around it. So when something is happening there, there's a high risk of no off-ramp from escalation, which is really worrying.
Anything to add, Nick?
No.
Okay. Might take this question.
Are Trump's policy de-risking?
Making chips and supply chain come to U.S. as part of the de-risking strategy?
I think that's part of it, but again, I think one of the things that we call out in the book is that we also want to see that materialize, right? You have the example of Foxconn's commitment to Wisconsin. How much of that was actually built?
Right.
And so for us, it's sort of like having been a little bit in the game, what you say when you have the White House announcement and then what is actually built like 5-10 years later, the length that it would take to set that up would surpass a third term for the president. My challenge would be, is that commitment still there if the political reality in the U.S. changes? I think on specifically on Taiwan though, and I think for me as someone that spent a lot of time thinking about Chinese foreign policy in this space too, I think in the U.S. there's often this like 2027 analogy that like in particular, military planning and intelligence organizations love, because then it's like there's a specific date, and then after that we can put a X% likelihood that there will be a conflict, referring to commitments made by Xi. My view is, from a Chinese government perspective, Hong Kong 2.0 scenario is much more likely. You have slow and committed elite co-option inside. You have a business interest continuing to be more integrated, and you have continued investment in political influence in the region. To me, that scenario, long-term shifting towards improving relationships with mainland, much more likely than the hot conflict. The problem around the hot conflict, to Ansgar's point, is just the results would be so devastating. And right now, the lines of communication are not that great in order to sort of evade that. And if you look back again, using Cold War as analogy, some of the most concerning reads is the Tom Schellinger reflections on how close that they actually got to potentially devastating conflict and how little that changed. And if you think about the communication now, just on trade, imagine if that was sort of a serious security situation that was rapidly escalating, not just between US and China, but also with Taiwan in the mix and having its own view and its own decision-making process. I think that would get complicated very fast.
Yeah, we don't even have a deconfliction mechanism, as both of you have outlined.
Exactly.
Right? So that's something that keeps me up at night.
Yeah.
I'm going to answer this one question and then get to someone else here in the audience. So from Sharik Zafat, there's no conversation in DC on tech goes by without mentioning of AI. So this is on AI, artificial intelligence. What should the US government approach be towards open source AI models in light of DeepSeek, Manus, etc.? So for those who probably are not familiar, DeepSeek and Manus are open source large language models that I think a lot in the US were kind of caught or surprised by. But I know you guys weren't, so please feel free to weigh in.
No, we weren't. We called it out, and I should just say, just given that this overlaps a bit with my day job, that speaking here in personal capacity, I think from an AI perspective, first and foremost, it's important to define what we mean by open source, right? Everyone's throwing this around and saying DeepSeek is open source. No, it's not. It's open model weights. It's not released yet. It's training data for a good reason. And that training data, as someone that's played around with it on a virtual machine, very clearly is impacted by Chinese government censorship. That's why you can get it to not say things. But I think the benefit from, if you think about from enterprise perspective, does it matter what the chatbot's response is to June 4th if you're just trying to get it to create a customer service chatbot for an SME? It does not, right? And so there's some benefits to that. I think the other thing from an open source perspective is, Ansgar has talked about this, is RISC-V, an open source architecture for compute. That's a whole different story. And then finally, and I think really importantly, security. We've seen a number of issues related to open source security. And I think a lot of times people say, well, if it's open source, then anyone can go in and test it, and that way it will be secure. If you actually work with the companies that does that, they do not necessarily do extensive security testing before they inject open source software into a supply chain. And so it creates huge, huge security issues if we don't do a better job around protecting the platforms that enable it, but also making people more aware of what are the steps that you need to take to do it. I do think there's a lesson around Huawei and 5G in here that the US government really needs to pay attention to. We sort of let, quote unquote, Chinese company Huawei, and we talk about Huawei as a case example in the book, go from this company that really were producing subpar products, really, leveraging the Chinese domestic market to then eventually grow and be now a world leader in this space and creating not just subpar but cheaper, but superior and cheaper products in a lot of these spaces. I think there's a real risk, and I think there's a recognition in a number of AI companies. You've seen the statements from both Dario Almodei from Anthropic and Sam Altman from OpenAI, talking about the need to recommit to open source. I just think the challenge will be, again, talking specifically on what we mean with open source. Is it open weights? Is it open access to training data? Is it open everything? Right now, there's not a lot of quote-unquote truly open source models out there.
Maybe just
Go ahead,
one meta perspective on open source. I think there's a tendency to think about open source as a kind of a safe haven in a geopolitically fraught world, right? It's this kind of island of happiness. I think that's really not the case. Open source has a massive geopolitical problem.
Yeah.
Why? Because the governance is even more problematic than for proprietary technology.
Yeah.
So who's going to make sure that there's not another Log4j, that some open source project is not infiltrated systematically by your geopolitical opponent, and you use that technology, and the hypothetical, everybody could check potentially security levels, but no one's actually going to do it, creates a huge problem in the real world, right? Yeah. And we saw already that open source is already framed here in DC as a problem, as a geopolitical problem, right? So Raimondo went out with a statement. Mike Gallagher went out with statements, basically framing RISC-V cannot be, because that's basically a leakage of technology from the US to China, which doesn't fall under classical export controls because it's not IP, right? Mm-hmm. So what else can we do in order to prevent China actually using RISC-V in order to catch up? So I think it's imminent that you will see a crackdown, that open source will be factored in the geotech statecraft, and that there will be controls around open source. And it's pretty easy to do, actually. So what we saw with the Huawei case in 2019 was that these controls basically established, Huawei was put on the entity list, right? That was the tool, right? So a corporate entity-specific export control was put on it, and that basically not only included selling to Huawei, but any transaction, right? And transaction also means, in the end, it means even talking. Talking can be in transaction. If you basically talk about a project that includes IP, that's an export under US law, right? So you're basically meeting at a coffee machine and talking to someone who's a Chinese national can be an export. And that basically led to the situation where US companies had to refrain from attending 5G standard meetings where Huawei was in the room, because they're basically saying like, hey, I'm potentially violating US export control, so I have to leave the room when Huawei is in the room. So taking that example, applying it to open source means the easiest way to basically disrupt open source projects is putting the major contributors in these open source projects from a Chinese side on an entity list, and you basically block any US company from actually doing anything there. Yeah. And I think that's a reality that the open source community urgently needs to deal with. Right? It's a very imminent threat, and it can be really disruptive. So message here is we're not against open source, right? But we have an urgent ask. You need to take this more seriously. You cannot only put this hypothetical, everybody could check the code argument and pretend that this will protect you from geotech statecraft.
Yeah, hopefully they listen. We've got 5 minutes. I want to get to this woman here in the front with her question. If you can introduce yourself when the mic comes round as well. And keep the questions tight. We can see if we can get to another one at the end. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the discussion. I'm a fellow European currently researching in the University of Oxford, and I work also in defense tech sector in London. And my question is about exactly defense tech. We talked about the interdependency between Europe and the US, and there are a lot of interdependencies there. First of all, highlighting there is a lot of venture capital investment from the US coming to European defense tech companies, especially with European governments' increased demand in spending on actual defense capabilities and trying to reshape the European procurement system. So my question is, how do you see that interdependency playing out in Europe, especially in the defense tech sector, between European defense tech startups who have experience in Ukraine and testing their systems in Ukraine, venture capitalists from potentially the United States, and then government relations within the US and Europe being a bit more turbulent than we are used to?
Thank you, and thank you for bringing up Ukraine as well.
I can take a quick stab of that. So I think that's actually a good response to the previous question on public-private partnerships, right? Where you could have part of the challenge for a lot of European startups is access to cheap capital. And so this is where you could see a role between having solutions providers and having access to capital in Europe, and to your point, having it frankly battle tested on the grounds in Ukraine. I think a big issue around defense procurement in Europe is, as with a lot of issues around Europe, and you'll know this as a researcher in this space, is coordination on the procurement. We are not very good at coordinating even within EU what we buy. And so if we were slightly better at that, we might be able to have A, more aligned capabilities, and B, probably access to cheaper things. Now, the good news is that there's a couple of really strong European quote-unquote defense primes, right? We've got Leonardo, we've got the Airbuses of the world, et cetera. So there are some, and they're really cool startups in this space. Helsing is like a great example of like an AI startup that's been doing some of this work in Ukraine, for example, that I'm familiar with. And so I do think that there is some space around it. I think the challenge will be, again, building the quote-unquote independent stack. If we have to not only coordinate our procurement, but then also make sure that we have only European capital and can buy only European, that gets challenging. If we recognize the coordination challenge in procurement, but we maintain the allied approach and, for example, can leverage access to capital in the US, can leverage access to US defense primes, and can complement that with European innovation systems and small and medium-sized businesses, focused to Ansgar's point on making yourself invaluable in parts of that chain, I think hugely important. The last thing I'll just say is this very clearly, and this is something that maybe we've criticized sort of the debate in DC a lot. I will also say the debate in Brussels, I think there is silent recognition, but not outspoken recognition. We have benefited a lot from the peace dividend in the last 50 years in Europe. As someone that straddles both a European identity and a somewhat American identity, for me, it's great to see that there's at least now talk about stepping up from a European perspective. I'm keenly watching whether that be followed by action.
Excellent. I think on that note, we might have to leave it there. My last plug is also for you all to sign up to International Intrigue at internationalintrigue.io. It's a daily geopolitical newsletter which I co-founded. And also join me, please, in thanking this excellent discussion between Nick and also Ansgar, and buy their book outside. So thank you.
Thank you.